while the US says that there's a negotiation beginning, the Chinese say, no, actually, there is no negotiation. The Chinese are playing hardball. They're simply holding their fire and waiting for Trump to make more concessions.
Neil, let me start here. I think a consideration on President Trump's, posting on social media telling Vladimir Putin to stop in capital letters in what is a striking post for social media, but I wonder if is that a real helpful channel to pass this message through to the Russian president? Is this a change of direction and mood towards the Kremlin?
I think President Trump is learning the hard way that negotiating the end to a war is a very difficult thing to do, especially if the side that your country backed, in this case Ukraine, is in a relatively weak position, and the other side is Russia. There's a reason that diplomacy has traditionally been secret rather than public, and this goes back a long way. We don't need to just talk about the era of social media. Ever since there has been any kind of public media, diplomacy has tended to be conducted behind closed doors because it's harder to do it in public. Working out a deal that ends the conflict in Ukraine requires both Russia and Ukraine to make compromises because their positions are so far apart. It has always struck me as unlikely that that would be achieved by publicly humiliating Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office or publicly sending truth social messages to Vladimir Putin. I never thought this war would be quickly over. I've written that multiple times, and I didn't think Donald Trump had a magic wand. So here we are.
Yes, indeed. Well, just to follow on from that then, the Times reports that Britain is likely to abandon plans to send thousands of troops to protect Ukraine because the risks are deemed too high. I wonder if this is this the art of the deal as far as Keir Starmer is concerned, to put it on the table only to withdraw it weeks down the line in order to offer something of a concession perhaps to Vladimir Putin?
That seems like the most positive spin you could possibly put on this, Callum. My own interpretation is that it was a somewhat rash commitment by a Prime Minister who didn't fully understand the extent to which the British Army has been shrunk in the last decade or so. And since Britain's defence capabilities are so much less than most people in the British public realise, as well as in the British political class, there must come a moment when somebody at the Ministry of Defence says, Prime Minister, may I have a word? And points out that there isn't really the capability to do this. In any case, it's one of the great problems that Keir Starmer and the European leaders face, that if the United States is no longer wholly committed to the North Atlantic Treaty, if Article 5, the one for all for one clause, is contingent, then at some point the Europeans have to figure out how do they deal with Russia without the United States. And that's the moment that you realize that Britain and Europe are just miles and miles away from being able to do that. They're years away from strategic autonomy. We're just at the very beginnings of European and British rearmament. In fact, it hasn't really begun in the British case. So this pledge has had to be taken off the table because it was never credible. And I thought that the minute I heard that he'd made it.
So we turn to other man-made problems facing the world right now, and let's focus on President Trump and what you described, Neil, as the tariff pandemic, the comparison you draw to the COVID pandemic and Donald Trump's tariffs. Mar-a-Lago's the new Wuhan, perhaps. Where are we at? Why is that comparison? Why is that one you're making?
Well, if you think about what Donald Trump unveiled on April 2nd, that was Liberation Day in his terms, it was as big a shock to the world economy as the news that we received around 5 years ago that there was a new and highly infectious virus that had emanated from Wuhan in China. The virus led to a sudden shutdown in passenger traffic, in trade, in economic activity, one of the biggest shocks that the world economy has ever experienced. And what has happened in the last few weeks has been comparable. with the difference that Trump has had to walk back quite a number of the things that he announced on April 2nd. If he hadn't, then we would be in a comparably bad position as we were in March of 2020. So the key thing to notice here is that there has been quite a considerable dilution of the April 2nd tariffs. The reciprocal tariffs have been postponed. Big carve-outs were announced for a variety of things, in particular electronics. And so it's not as big a shock as initially seemed, but it's still pretty bad because the American average tariff rate is back to somewhere like where it was in the 1930s. It's roughly 10 times where it was last year. It's early to see this in the data. Economic data lag behind reality, usually by a month or two. But you can see in, for example, shipments from China to the port of Los Angeles that there's been a very steep drop. And so in the coming weeks and months, we're going to see a bunch of other economic indicators roll over as this shock unfolds. Because the one thing that Trump has not diluted until maybe he's begun to in the last 24 hours is the tariffs on China, which he ratcheted up to such a high level that people no longer were sure what the tariff rate on Chinese goods was, but way above 100%. That's the critical thing now that Trump is, I think, trying to walk back, because he's had it explained to him that actually the US economy still relies on China for a lot of different things, from toys to shoes to and critically important components in goods that get finished in the United States. So it's hard to know exactly where this all ends. But what's certain is that the world economy received a comparably big shock to the shock of COVID 5 years ago. You can already see that in the IMF's most recent report. And it just remains to be seen how long that shock will last. There isn't a vaccine for Donald 25, but there kind of is. And the vaccine's the political backlash that is forcing him to walk back a lot of what he announced on April 2nd.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, because it was one of the first things I wrote down as soon as I started reading your essay and the comparison to the pandemic, and I wrote, what is the vaccine? And I wonder if actually there's, to take that a bit further, has the global response been unified? I feel like with COVID, there was a unified response, but it was nuanced. So there was lockdown, but it was perhaps done differently in different places. Travel was ended, but with different lengths of time, different quarantine measures, these sorts of things. Has the world been capable of functioning in unity against Trump, or actually has there been a kind of nuance within the responses from different leaders and different nations?
Well, there the analogy breaks down, because in the case of Donald 25, you can go and negotiate. You couldn't negotiate with the virus. You can go to Wuhan and cut a deal, but you can go to Washington and try and cut a deal. And indeed, Trump wants governments to do that. And the Indian government and the Japanese government are amongst the first to try to engage. But, 90 days is not a long time. And it's actually a blink of an eye when it comes to trade negotiations. And trying to do deals with not only India and Japan, but also the European Union in such a short time frame is really difficult. So that's the process that's underway right now. I think one has to be a bit skeptical about how much will get done within that 90-day time frame. And remember, the big issue, the US-China relationship, is not moving at all, because while the US says that there's a negotiation beginning, the Chinese say, no, actually, there is no negotiation. The Chinese are playing hardball. They're simply holding their fire and waiting for Trump to make more concessions. So that's a way in which this is a very different shock from the shock of 2020. And I think because you can get Trump to fold, or at least walk back some of what he's done, the shock will ultimately be less than the shock of COVID, because the shock of COVID shut down a huge number of human activities for the better part of a year, and even longer in some cases. I think that much of what Trump unveiled on April 2nd is kind of melting like a snowball in the sun, and we're going to be left with a much diluted version of reciprocal tariffs and a much diluted version of the trade war with China, I still think it has a meaningful economic impact. It's not clear if it produces a recession, but it's clearly going to slow the US economy down to a growth rate of around 1%. That's sort of the consensus view among economists, from something closer to 3%. Probably puts prices up, which makes it harder for the Fed to cut rates. One of the key things that did remind me of the spring of 2020 was the crisis in the bond market. In the wake of April 2nd, there was a really nerve-wracking period when there was a kind of liquidity crisis in the bond market. People were selling US bonds, yields were going up, even as the dollar was weakening, a very rare combination of events. And that was the thing that persuaded Trump to delay the reciprocal tariffs for 90 days. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent sat him down at some point and said, Mr. President, if you carry on, you are going to cause a financial crisis comparable with 2008, which was when Lehman Brothers blew up. So Trump had to finally acknowledge that he'd overstepped. And that's, I think, one of the things that's most striking about the events of the last, well, nearly 3 weeks now. We began with an absolutely mind-blowing shock to the world economy. And since then, there has been a succession of retreats.
Where does this leave President Trump? I noted some polling that suggests his approval rating has dropped to about 45%. It was at 52% 1 week after he took office. It's fair to say that he has blinked, then blinked again when it comes to tariffs. If you are somebody who voted for the Make America Great Again president, who wanted to end wars, who wanted to redefine international trade, who wanted to bring manufacturing jobs back to the US, with this sort of man-made 100-day marker approaching, how is Trump doing?
Well, it's early days. 100 days is not a long period of time in American politics. And the impact of the tariff shock has not really reached ordinary Americans yet. Prices haven't gone up in most sectors. In fact, oil prices have come down, which Americans do notice when they fill up their gas guzzling cars, and the jobs market remains strong. The U.S. economy entered 2025 still roaring along, and so I don't think we can draw any conclusions yet about how popular President Trump will be 200 or 300 days in. I think it's going to be much more interesting to look at the polling by the time we get to, let's say, September, after the summer, because by that time, the consequences of the tariffs will have made themselves felt in prices, and they will have made themselves felt in the businesses that have had to reduce labor. And it will be amazing to me then if he's not quite significantly underwater in terms of approval. There will be a lot of people in, say, Michigan who voted for Trump who are being impacted by the disruption that the tariffs caused, not least to relations between the US and Canada. So it would simply amaze me if he wasn't in significant political trouble later this year when the costs of the tariff shock are actually impacting ordinary Americans. But we're not there yet.
Yeah, fair enough. Absolutely fair enough. It's the rate of change has been so rapid. It has been unpredictable. It has been shocking, as we say, in so many ways. Does the UK have a government that is equipped to deal with this? Are we as agile as we need to be? I'm thinking of Rachel Reeves being in Washington these last couple of days at the IMF. She seems to be the only person that I can find that is optimistic of a good trade deal with the US on behalf of the UK at this point. I'm just wondering if there is a need for more agility in the UK government handling.
Well, the UK government does not have much room for manoeuvre because public finances are in a precarious state. And that's true if you look at the deficit, and it's true if you look at the likely direction of travel in the economy. There are unlikely to be great deals to be done with the United States. We've been round this roundabout once before, which was when we talked about a possible free trade deal back in the first Trump term, and it never really went anywhere. And it's hard to get these deals to happen because it nearly always boils down to things that the Americans want that British negotiators can't agree to. The same is true in negotiations with the Europeans. the Starmer government also has a preference to lean towards Europe rather than to the United States. So it's sort of embarrassing to be offered a trade deal by the United States, because that compromises the Prime Minister's preference to improve Britain's relations with Europe post Brexit. So, Rachel Reeves is bound to talk in as upbeat a way as she can, but I really don't envy her the situation she's in. Britain is in a relatively vulnerable position fiscally, and as a relatively open economy that relies a lot on trade and capital flows being free, it's not well positioned for a world in which those things are being restricted by tariffs and other measures. The upside might be, and I say might with a sort of three times underlined, that some of those investors who think that they want to reduce their exposure to the United States might want to increase their exposure to the UK as well as to Europe. But what does that translate into? It could translate into a stronger pound. We've already seen the pound actually rally against the dollar in the last few weeks, and that doesn't necessarily help the Chancellor of the Exchequer either. So I think buckle up. The only consolation for Rachel Reeves is that pretty much every country is experiencing the economic consequences of Mr. Trump, and Britain is just that little bit weaker in terms of its fiscal room for manoeuvre.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm really enjoying speaking to you. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure, Callum.